So let's take a look at how to evaluate chess positions using activity. Now there's a more nuanced way of evaluating positions using positional elements, which is discussed in later modules. So in this particular module, we're looking at activity, not particularly the elements of a position, namely weak pawns, weak squares, two bishops, two knights, so forth and so on. In this particular case, we'll simply be using activity to evaluate a chess position. This is the faster way. This is the way that a lot of masters and grandmasters tend to do it. And if you wanted to go deeper, you can certainly break the position down further into its elements, as is discussed. So practical evaluation used by grandmasters. Here we merely glance at the position to determine who is better, right? We merely focus on piece activity, right? The side with more piece activity tends to be better. And where it's unclear, we can basically evaluate the position as somewhat equal. So how do we evaluate piece activity? Like pieces tend to have the greatest activity and mobility in the center. So if you look at the center here, and when we're talking about the center, we're talking about the extended center. Here, as you can see, these 16 squares, right? Typically when beginners are introduced, we talk about the center right in the middle here. This is where you want to put your pawns and pieces, particularly your pawns in the opening, right? Because they will help control more squares and will also help minimize your opponent's activity. So it just happens to be the case that in these 4 central squares, in these 16 central squares, that the pieces are most active. And let's just take a look at an example here. For example, if you look at these 3 knights, notice that the knight on b4 has 6 squares that it's controlling. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The knight here, which is on the extended center. So if you look at the extended center again, it controls about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Square on h8 is certainly controlling 2 squares. So this one would be the worst placed knight. This would be the best placed knight. And this knight here would be slightly worse than this one. So in conclusion, you want to place your pieces primarily on the 16 squares here because they'll have the most activity and they'll control the most squares. So if you look at the evaluation of all knights, the knight on e4 is the best knight. So similarly here, we have this bishop here, which is on the 16 central squares, and it controls the most squares. It controls 13 squares. The bishop here on a3 controls about, I believe, 9 squares. And I believe this one controls 9 squares on g5 rather. 9 squares. In here, this one controls 7 squares. This one is on the edge. So on the edge, pieces tend to be worse. Towards the center, they tend to be better. And a little bit away from the center, they tend to be slightly better. So you want to centralize your pieces. So that's what we mean by controlling the center and putting the pieces on the central squares. So now figure out why it is the case that you must develop knights before bishops, right? So knights tend to be worse. As you can see, the knight here is on the edge of the board and the knight on the edge is worse, right? Knight on the brim is dim. So if you were given a choice here between bishop c4 and knight f3, typically you want to have play knight f3 because the knight here is worse placed than the bishop, right? So this improves your position a lot better than it would bishop c4. Right? I mean, certainly this is an opening, but on principle, right, for principles that go on hundreds of years, it was generally the case that you want to develop the knights first before you develop the bishops, because the knights tend to be slower to come to the centralized position, and bishops can get in there within one move, right? So this is why you should develop knights first, and of course, this is why you don't want to develop the queen early, right? Developing the queen increases in activity a lot quicker than all the other pieces. So you want to develop your queen last of all. So this is where these rules come from, right? Some people just memorize them without understanding where they're coming from, right? They come from improving the mobility or the activity of the pieces and the overall activity of your position. So knight f3 would improve the overall activity of your position. So this is where these rules come from all of a sudden. Yeah, hopefully this makes more sense now. So how pieces increase in activity? Again, we said centralized, right? You want to place them in the extended center, the 16 squares that we discussed. Advanced pieces gain in activity. So the more advanced your pieces are, the more active they are. So a knight on e5 will be better than a knight on e4. Why? Because a knight on e5 is more advanced and therefore more active. And it's also large in the enemy's position, for example, if you're playing white. So now let's just take a look at an example of evaluating at a glance, right? We just take in the whole position in a single glance and we figure out who's better. Well, here, white is better. Why is white better? Simply because this knight here is on the edge and it's worse, right? Everything else here is almost about equal, right? The rooks are in open files, and it is, despite white being down on a pawn, this is actually evaluated as better for white by Stockfish. Let's look at this. This is Hikaru versus Sina Moved. Hopefully I didn't botch that. So Stockfish evaluates this as 1.5 for white. Why? Right, let's just evaluate this at a glance. Take the whole position in. Look at these 3 minor pieces. They're on the 2nd rank. Look at these minor pieces. They're on the 3rd and 4th rank. So just by looking at this, we can say that white is better, right? And also this bishop is hampered. It's still controlling too many squares. This bishop is somewhat hampered by these pawns. And yeah, this rook is just worse than either of white's rooks here, right? This one has 2 squares in the forward direction. This one has 1 square in the forward direction and has more squares here along the rank. So just by looking at the position at a glance, we can simply evaluate the position and say white is better here momentarily. And in fact, Hikaru went on to lose this position. Let's look at another position here with Hikaru. Let's take the position here at a glance. So look at the whole position. Yeah, white should be better here, right? Even if it's a slight advantage according to Starfish, about plus 0.4. Why is white better? Well, look at this knight and this knight. Comparatively, this knight is better. This bishop is somewhat hampered. This rook is worse than either of white's rooks, right? Looking at the forward and the file direction here, this rook has more squares, about 2, about 1. This one has 0 squares, right? It's blocked by its own pawn here. This bishop is somewhat worse. It's biting on granite compared to this bishop here. So this bishop, even though it's biting on granite, it has more squares. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4. This bishop is 1, 2, and 3, right? So this bishop would be better, and this bishop is certainly much better than this one because of just more scope. So it can go bishop e3. Yeah. But you can improve this bishop here by playing bishop a6, or perhaps rerouting the bishop along this diagonal here, away from this sort of pawn center here. You can also just open up the position, try to increase the scope of the bishop, thus increasing its valuation. And here, again, we just look at a final example. So everything is equal in terms of pawns. So black and white both have about equal pawns, if I'm not mistaken. So here are 2 pawns. These 2 pawns here and these 3 pawns here. So just by looking at the position here, it's quite clear that white is better. Why is white better? This rook has scope. This queen is nice and aggressively placed. This knight here is centralized, even though this knight is centralized with this one. And of course, the bishop positions here. Certainly, this bishop here is superior. This bishop here is just staring at its own pawn. It's like a pawn itself, right? It's blocked by its own pawn chain, and this rook has more scope than either of white's rooks. And here we have more space here. This pawn here would be stronger than either of these 2 pawns. So this pawn holds 2 pawns, and Stockfish evaluates this as 2.9. It's actually about 3 pawns if you let it sit for a while. So despite having an equal number of pawns, Stockfish evaluates this as superior for white by nearly 3 pawns. It is clear why. Without looking at any tactical blows, without looking at any specific moves, we can just look at this statically. Right, if we wanted to go into a deeper dive, right, into the position, we can look at the elements which I introduced in the course. How to train a skill, right, in quiet positions, try to evaluate the position by staring at the board and taking it in holistically, right? Then you just turn on Stockfish, or you turn on your local engine and see how the engine evaluates the position. In many cases, you will find that you will be correct. So in 80% of the cases, so this is a very quick way of really evaluating the position. So in cases where you are wrong, there's usually a tactical nuance that you may be unaware of. So this method of evaluation should work for most positions. So without delving deep into the positional elements, right, we can simply use this particular skill to evaluate positions. Of course, you can find out more about this lesson and this course, 4.5 hours of lessons here, diving deep into the positional elements, into in-game knowledge, into core clear path of how to gain proficiency and how to train and how to improve in chess. So you learn theoretical endgames, learn how to assess a position, you learn tactical patterns, tactical themes. This will be core foundational knowledge required for all players that are 200 to 2,200, right? So 2,200, right? You may find that you may have gaps in your general chess knowledge.